Hey, welcome to the Recovering Therapist. I'm glad you guys are here. I want to talk today a little bit about this idea about willpower versus the disease versus moral failings and see if we can explore and get in a little deeper and figure out kind of what's really going on when we start to look at addiction and how it's being affected. So, to start with, I want to talk a little bit about what is a disease. And when you think about a disease, for me, I think about it's some sort of maladaptation. Something isn't working the way it's designed to work within the body. If you think about cancer, you think about diabetes or maybe HIV, within all of those, something in the system isn't working the way it's supposed to. You think about cancer, the cells aren't reproducing the way that they should be. When you think about diabetes, the blood sugar isn't being managed the way that the body has actually designed it to be managed. And when you think about HIV, you think about the T1 cells, and they're not reproducing in a way that is designed to keep you healthy and safe. So when we talk about addiction being a disease, for me, the disease, the maladaptation, is actually part of what's going on within our brain. And specifically, we think about the brain, and I'm going to keep it really simple because I need to keep it simple for me. It's such a complex organ that it does so much. So I've just got to keep it simple because that's the best way that makes sense for me. So I've got what's called the old brain, and essentially it's the brain stem, and it kind of resides in the center of the brain. And it's in charge of all the automatic processes, right? So those automatic processes could include breathing, heartbeat, temperature, digestion. All of that stuff is designed through the old brain to be managed without you having to kind of think about it. It just automatically does it, which becomes important because if I had to spend time thinking about maintaining my blood pressure or making sure my breathing was adequate, I wouldn't get much done, right? So I almost died. I forgot to breathe, right? So it's automatic and it's already doing all of that stuff for us. So we just don't have to manage it in a conscious level. The outside or the new brain sits on top of the old brain. And basically what's happened is the old brain is there and then it's the new brain is kind of evolved. And the new brain is really kind of that outer cortex and it's really responsible for executive functioning or decision making or problem solving. So this idea of kind of where we think is where the new brain comes into play, right? So I've got the old brain, which is kind of that automatic process, and then the new brain, which allows me to kind of think through things. So we look at addiction, and if we believe that it is a disease model, we identify that it's within the brain, and specifically it's within the old brain. And there's a section in the old brain, and it's called the reward center. And essentially we get rewarded for certain behaviors. These behaviors typically are something that over evolution have evolved to the point where we need them in order to survive. So it's about survival. So if you think about some of those behaviors like eating, right? I need to be able to eat in order to survive. When we think about sex, I need to have sex in order to keep the species going. They also think that exercise, right? Back in the old days, right? You needed to be able to outrun a saber-toothed tiger or else you might die. So those are primaries. Also, making sure that you stay hydrated, so that you've got water. I don't know if you ever remember as a kid, maybe you're playing on a summer day out in the front yard running around and you take a break and you go over to the side of the house and crank the hose on and let the warm water run out and you get to the cold water and take a drink and it's some of the best damn water that you ever had, right? It maybe still had a little bit of that rubbery flavor, but by God, that was good water. That's the reward center firing because it wants you to continue the species, right? So the whole purpose of the reward is basically encouraging a behavior. An example of, as an adult, maybe you've got a 6-year-old child and they make their bed for the first time and it's maybe a little sloppy, but you're not going to tell them that. You're going to praise them. You're going to say, that's the best damn bed that I've never seen. Here's $1. That's an awesome bed. I really appreciate you making it. And the reason why we would do that is we don't want to be making their bed when they're 15 or 16 years old. We want to make sure that we encourage the behavior. So basically, that's what's going on in that reward center of the brain. And that is making sure that we encourage certain behaviors in order for us to survive. Basically, it works off a neurochemical. And the chemical, you may have heard of it before, it's called dopamine. It's a neurotransmitter. And essentially, it's a feel-good. There's some other neurotransmitters, but dopamine is basically, it's the one that's the feel-good. It tells you everything's going to be okay. And so when we do those other behaviors like eating, drinking, having sex, the dopamine fires and it encourages to continue that behavior. So we look at addiction, and addiction has a propensity to kind of target some of that dopamine stuff. And that's where we have the maladaption when we talk about addiction. So the disease model, that's the maladaption. The maladaption is that reward center now begins to misinterpret that I need that substance in order to survive. And so when I think about old brain and new brain, typically old brain will trump new brain unless I really put some time and effort into figuring out how do I manage that. Because remember, old brain's automatic process. Old brain is we're just going to go do it. And so when it starts to say, I need to drink, a lot of times it's like, okay, I need to drink. I need this in order to survive. And so that's the difference when I think about, is it willpower? Is it moral failing? Or is it really the disease model? And for me, it becomes pretty clear, I think, that it is more about the disease model, because I can still have some willpower, but if I've got this thing in my brain that is all about survival and it's telling me I've got to do this or I may die, it's going to override a lot of that stuff. I may be able to maintain some willpower for a little bit, but eventually it will wear it down and I will need to go take care of that. I will need to go use a substance because I've interpreted it as needing to survive. So we've talked about those are basically reinforcing behaviors. So they get reinforced by the dopamine. There are basically two types of reinforcements that we see primarily. The first is called a positive reinforcement, and it's probably what it sounds like for you, is that when I do a behavior, I get a positive feeling. It feels good to do that behavior. And so by doing that, I get some sense of accomplishment. So again, if we go back to that example of the child making the bed, we are rewarding them. We are telling them what a great job they're doing. They feel good about themselves. They feel proud that they've done something that has pleased somebody else. There's also the negative reinforcement. And with the negative reinforcement, essentially what that means is I don't feel so good. And if I do a behavior, that not so good, that bad feeling goes away. I think for me, when I think about part of my addiction, I struggled for a couple of years, in and out, relapsing, struggling, even before coming in and trying my first shot at recovery. There was a lot of shame that was associated with my drinking because I knew what I was doing wasn't right, but I couldn't seem to not do it. And so there was a lot of shame and guilt and remorse that came along with it. But what I found is, the way that kind of went away is if I drank a little bit, and that shame and those negative feelings would go away. And so in essence, what I was doing is I was reinforcing that drinking behavior in a negative way, as well as I would drink and I would also kind of feel good because maybe I wasn't feeling as great either, but it would also give me some of that dopamine push. So I think that kind of when we talk about the willpower, right? Again, that's not going to be enough because it's going up against survival. And if willpower is being interpreted as counter to survival, eventually the body's going to say, no, we need to do this in order to survive. So that sets up a lot of different systems. And we think about, the moral failing piece also, I think, comes to mind. I think one of the big challenges when we look at the disease model, and sometimes why people struggle with that is the people that are affected by our disease feel like maybe that's a little bit of an out. And I can understand that. I think the difference between when you think about, cancer or diabetes, The consequences for the behaviors don't necessarily affect somebody else the way that if I get intoxicated and act the fool, I hurt other people. And so there's some resentment that gets developed and evolves with that over a period of time. So a lot of times they want you to be accountable for it. So, there's that balance between, how do I hold myself accountable? Why do I just get that free ride and say, well, it's a disease, it doesn't matter? I would challenge that it's not about a free ride as it is about just understanding, right? I think one of the things when we get into recovery is we need to look at the data, to understand the data and not be judgmental about it. Neither good nor bad, it just is. Here's the reality of it. Here's the truth. Now, understanding that we have hurt people. So now that we're sober, how are we going to resolve that? How are we going to rectify that? How do we change that? And so that's part of what recovery becomes is, how do I get to a place where I'm comfortable with me? I want to talk a little bit about when we set up the disease model of addiction. What is the goal of the addiction and what does that mean? For me, the goal of the addiction is to continue to use. And when I frame it in that perspective, I start to understand a lot of those behaviors, even when I was sober, but was still struggling with drinking, even though I didn't want to drink, but I still did. The goal of the addiction was always there to push. And so that challenged a lot of my kind of moral beliefs or my thoughts. Let's say I noticed that I started to be dishonest. In order for me to drink, I had to be dishonest. Because if I was honest with you, you would say, man, you need to not drink, right? So I start to compromise some of my values, some of my morals in order to meet that goal of the addiction. And lastly, I want to talk a little bit about when we look at the reward center and how that process starts. The reward center begins even before we do the behavior. So as I'm starting to move towards that behavior, the dopamine starts to fire because what it wants is it wants me to continue on to make sure I complete that behavior. And if we think in that regard, we start to understand how do those triggers start to affect us. I don't know if we'll talk a little bit more about triggers as we move forward with this channel, but basically it becomes a setup where I see something and the dopamine gets pushed and it starts the whole kind of chain reaction to the point where I actually go drink. I've worked with people, including myself, that, there's this idea that, sometimes I just go drink and I never understand what happened. And I've worked with them and people have relapsed and I've asked, well, why did you relapse? And they'll say, I don't know, I just did. And that tells me that basically where we're at is that old brain is still overriding everything. We'll talk a little bit moving forward about how do we address that? How do we train to that? How do we make sure that we just don't let the old brain override and run roughshod over the new brain? And so as we move forward, again, that will be one of those things that we will look at. In closing, I'd like to hear your story. I'd like to hear what you have to say. Do you feel like do you feel like addiction is a disease? Do you feel like it's a moral failing? Or do you feel like that maybe you just don't have enough willpower? I'd be interested in what you have to say. And I appreciate your time listening, and you guys have an awesome day. Be safe.